Welcome to our discussion about MCAS. What does it mean for immigrant students? My name is John Lozada, and I have a title of Director of Community Engagement for the Boston Private Industry Council. That actually relates to the Boston Public Schools high school renewal process, which is an effort to try to take the big schools in Boston and break them into small learning communities to try to make the schools more effective in terms of the education that's provided to students, but also to provide environments where the teachers and the faculty and the administrators actually know the students and can build relationships that help decrease the alienation that we find so much of a draw down on real learning in the schools. Our goal today is to talk about the MCAS from the immigrant perspective. I wanted to share a quick image with you from a language perspective. There are a couple of things that I think about when I think about the MCAS and I think about ethnic students. The word diligencias. Anybody know what that word diligencias means? In Spanish, when you have errands and you're responsible to carry out your day of chores, whatever, you have diligencias. If you think about that, that means diligencies. Kind of an esoteric word, you know? And it's full of image, it's rich in terms of connotation. And in some ways, what MCAS is trying to do is really get from students their ability to express that they understand the meaning of things. And what a beautiful word to sort of connect to that process. But we don't reach it because the MCAS doesn't test in Spanish yet. But the complication for me comes in a different word. One time I was in Washington, D.C., in a restaurant. I'm Puerto Rican and Mexican by background. And I was in a Mexican restaurant that was being run by Salvadorans. And I asked for the food was very salty. I won't go back there. But I asked the person for a glass of water. And he said to me, lo traigo ahorita. I'll bring it. To me, ahorita meant in a little while. To him, coming from El Salvador, ahorita meant I'll bring it to you right now. So when he showed up in a second, I was sort of embarrassed because I had gotten angry. But you see, so the complication of language and the subtlety, and that's just one language. In the Boston Public Schools, at English high school, for example, you might have between 25 and 50 languages spoken at a particular point in time. So today, I hope that our discussion, it was sort of framed as a debate in some respects, but I think that really what we want to do is get some ideas in terms of how we start answering those kinds of questions and making sure that students really have the chance to show what they understand and that they're being measured in ways that are going to keep them pushing and taking advantage of these new federal laws and state laws that we were talking about just a second ago. We're lucky today to have Alice Fernandez with us. And Alice is a student and a senior at Madison Park High School, and she's going to be talking a little bit about her experience with the MCAS. We're also blessed, and I'm not going to do long bios so we can get right to the substance of this, but we're blessed with having Andy Calkins here. Andy is Executive Director of Mass Insight Education and Research Institute, which is an independent nonprofit group focused on using higher standards of reform to improve student achievement in Massachusetts and ultimately across the nation. Counselor Felix Arroyo was supposed to be here today, but unfortunately he was not able to attend because he has, based on this cold we've got, a flood in his basement. So instead his legislative aide, Jamie Wilmot, is going to help and fill in, and so we're grateful for you stepping in on short notice. Paul Revel, John Lindemuth is here also, who is the Director of Workforce, which is a Cambridge Housing Authority-sponsored youth support program. And John has taken sort of the bull by the horns and trying to focus right in on the MCAS issue in implementing programs that he'll talk about today. This discussion will be moderated by Paul Revel. Paul's a lecturer at the Harvard University Graduate School of Education and is currently the Executive Director of the Center for Education, Research and Policy at Mass Inc., which is an independent, evidence-based think tank dedicated to the improvement of K-12 public education in Massachusetts. I love the work that Paul does. He really tries to bring all the pieces of the discussion into play. I serve on that as an advisory member to his work with Mass Inc. For today, my hope is that, again, we get our discussion focusing on solutions, suggestions, ideas, beyond just the battle of whether MCAS is fair or not fair. There was a student survey that some of the organizers of this conference they shared with me, and students were asked, do you think MCAS is fair? It was a group of about 300 kids running across the range of K through 12. And there were concerns around the MCAS not being fair. I'm not sure why, because we didn't really draw that down. But that concern is in the community, and it's something we can't ignore. With that, Alice, if you would read your paper.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Alice Fernandez. I'm a senior at Madison Park Second Vocational High School in Roxbury. And I came from Cape Verde 4 years ago. I have also volunteered in a youth program at Dorchester, which is Massachusetts Alliance of Portuguese Speakers, where I educate Cape Verdean youth about STDs, drugs, and violence in our community. But today, I'm here to talk about the MCAS test. A test that has brought mixed feelings, since it started. I can see from my own point of view that most of our youth, especially the immigrant youth, are very not happy with this new testing system. In my opinion, the MCAS is an unfair test because it does not measure students' overall knowledge or academic success. I have so many friends in my school that are A students, but they failed the first test by 1 or 2 points. And now they have to take the MCAS again in order for them to graduate. There are a lot of students that are not good at taking tests, including myself. And they have to depend on the MCAS in order to go to college. When it comes time to take the MCAS, the majority of the students are stressed, and those who feel more overwhelmed, and many of them give up on their dreams to attend college just because of simple tests. For immigrant students, the situation is even worse because of the language. They use words that we never seen in our lives before, not even in schools. The way they ask some questions, it's so complicated that even though if we know the answers, we can't put it down because we don't know what's being asked, because they use words that we never seen before. Many of my friends that have English as a second language, including myself, told me that they guessed, or some of them leave many questions blank. Some questions they could answer, but they just didn't answer it because they couldn't understand what's being asked. In my opinion, MCAS should not be a requirement for students to graduate from high school and attend college. I did not score too well in this test, but I'm still an honor student at my school. And I have just been awarded a 4-year full tuition scholarship to attend a college in Pennsylvania. It's clear that this test does not measure individuals and academic success. So I really hope that this testing system can be re-evaluated for the benefits of thousands of youth in the state of Massachusetts, especially immigrant students. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alice. The way we're going to proceed today is to have opening statements, brief opening statements from all of our presenters, and then we're going to come back and open it up for discussion both between the presenters and with you as members of the audience. So the next person I'd like to recognize is Andy Calkins.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Alice. When we got the email from the conference organizers saying that you were going to join us today, they said, and Alice will talk about the good and the bad of MCAS. And I'm waiting and hoping that by the end of this hour and a half or however long we have here, that after the discussion that we have up here and with everybody in the room, that along with the bad, and we can all agree that there's a lot that we would change, that at the heart of the entire effort of which MCAS is one part, there's also some good. And the way I'm going to try to launch that part of the conversation is by using a metaphorical organizing device. This looks like an apple, but it is in fact an onion, and it walks and talks and acts and tastes like an apple. And an apple is the tried and true metaphor for education. I'd like to suggest that an onion is a better metaphor for education in ways that will become clear as we go along. The onion, this in fact would be an onion if we had one in our drawer this morning, and you wouldn't believe how hard it is to buy an onion in downtown Boston. So this is why we have the apple. Think of it as an onion. The onion is a lot more complex than an apple. On the outside, and in restaurant write-ups, they always call it the sweet Vidalia onion and everything. But the more you peel it off, the stinkier it gets until you get into the middle, and it makes you start to cry. And that is in fact what the standards-based reform movement and its efforts to try to improve education is like. I'll tell you what I mean. Think of the outer layer of this onion as where we were when right up the street they passed 10 years ago the Mass Education Reform Act. So that was the status quo. And if you had a sister who was 10 years older than you and who was going through schools here, we can probably all agree in this room that the odds were incredibly stacked against your sister, that mythical sister. Just think of all the things that go into making education good. You need money, and in those days, schools and districts that did not have money really didn't have money. And there were lots of tales of classrooms with 50 kids in them, and lots of tales of incredible disparities between poor spending districts in schools and rich spending districts in schools. Just horrible disarray. You need some consensus about achievement goals so that everybody knows what we're aiming for. And obviously, back then, the goals in Wellesley and Lexington were a lot different than the goals for most kids in Dorchester or Madison Park. You need strong curricula, you need strong teachers, across the board. The status quo was not a model of education that's worth defending. So let's just agree that at least at that outer layer of the apple, there's reasonable consensus, and that whatever else happens, we don't want to go back there. The next layer, if we unpeeled the outer one here, is what began to happen in 1993, and that is the application of this principle of higher standards. Okay, what does that mean? When you strip everything else away, what higher standards means is that we were replacing time, which used to be the measurement by which we decided whether somebody should get a diploma or not, with skills. And that sort of seems self-evident and like a big duh, and well, isn't that really what school has been and is and should be all about? And the answer is yes. But the real answer, given by the status quo 10 years ago, was that it was not that way. And that if you were a kid who showed up enough days at school and took whatever the minimal required courses were, the state required 1 year of American history and 4 years of gym, and that was it. Then you got your diploma and you were decreed to be a high school graduate. Did that necessarily mean that you could read and write? No, and in fact, it gave rise to extreme disparities in perceptions where kids, this is according to a poll from Public Agenda, kids and parents in the 90s and even up to the present, by 3/4 or so, think that their skills are ready to be applied successfully to the real world, whether that's a job or college or whatever. But the employers and the college professors who are receiving them out of high school, by the same 3/4, say they're not, and they're not by a wide margin. So your older sister, the mythical older sister who's been getting B's and C's or maybe some A's all the way along and has been told you're doing just fine, in fact was not developing the skills that she really needed to not just attend college, but then to succeed in college or on the job. All right, so that's the next application of standard was just simply this sea change of an idea to replace time with skills. We as a society operate on that assumption because if Paul's going under the knife for an operation tomorrow, he doesn't want somebody operating on him who has not been tested and has not succeeded in acquiring the skills necessary to remove his appendix or whatever is going to happen to you tomorrow. He wants somebody who he's got some confidence in. When we walk out of this room and go across the street, we're assuming that the people driving on the street ahead of us have been given approval to know how to drive, such that we can be reasonably secure in walking across the street and know that we're not going to get hit by the car. All right, so that's the next layer, and I'm hoping everybody is still more or less with me. The next two layers is where we start to get a little bit stinky in this onion. What allows us to have that trust walking across the street? One is that that person's skills in that car or in that operating room have been tested. That's the testing part. And another part is that those tests actually meant something. So that if the doctor who's going to operate on Paul failed his test, he still couldn't just go ahead and get his medical diploma and be certified to operate. So that's accountability. And testing and accountability are the ways that ensure that skill levels, that we really are using skill as the basis for advancement out of school and not just time. All right, now we get into the core of the onion, and this is where things really start to smell, because now we're getting into all the ways that the sort of lofty abstract principles that I've just talked about play out in the real world. The devil is always in the details. What are the things underneath those abstract principles that make us all have such differences of opinion about standards? One is the universality of the requirement. People say some kids can't do this, and MCAS is hurting some of those kids. SPED kids who go to voc tech schools and aren't getting enough English and math, kids who don't take paper tests well, kids who go to crummy schools that just haven't reformed themselves, kids who come from other countries and have language LEP issues. These are all absolutely valid arguments. And you won't get any argument from me about the validity of raising them. What it means is that the state has to step up to the plate and have answering programs for each of those complaints. I'll come back to that in a second. Another aspect in the core of the onion that is pretty stinky and has stunk up Massachusetts for a while is what we might call the locus of accountability. Who's being held accountable? Well, you guys have first. It's the students who have borne the brunt of accountability and higher standards in Massachusetts. And that looks and seems unfair to a lot of people, and it probably is. We'll come back to that. Finally, and maybe most importantly, there's the real impact of all of this on what's really going on in the classroom. How has MCAS standards, the whole thing, actually changed what's going on between teacher and student? Is it, in fact, narrowing curriculum? Is it prompting a whole lot of test prep and nothing else? Or is it doing some better things than that? These are all valid questions, and in Massachusetts, the way to address them is there's an article that has become one of my favorite articles. It was in Kaplan a couple of years ago. Maybe you know of it, about the good twin and the bad twin of standards-based reform. You remember that? I forget who the writer was, but he just laid out all of the characteristics of this enormous standards-based movement and how in some places it looks like the bad twin. And all the answers to all the questions I just raised in the center of the onion are bad ones. And then there's the good twin. When it's done right, all of those questions have plausible answers. In Massachusetts, which is quite often held up as a national model for how to do these things right, we haven't gotten them all right. we've gotten a lot of them right. And with 1 minute left, because I know I'm getting close, I'll take you through a few of them. Back at the very beginning, I asked, what are the things that go into making education good? You need money and equity. And that's one thing that the state has done an incredibly productive job of solving. If you didn't pick it up on your way out, pick up some of the materials that are right by the door. But among them is a copy of a newsletter called Reaching Higher, where we present some facts about how much the disparity between the poorest spending districts and the highest spending districts has narrowed in 10 years. It's incredible. And every district in the state now spends at least the foundation formula budget. So every district, every school has the minimum that it needs to spend what it needs to educate kids well. Curriculum, teachers, everything else is lagging behind the money, but the money is enabling Boston to have a curriculum that is a whole lot closer to what Lexington and Wellesley have than used to be the case. If you're a student who needs extra help, the state, almost alone among all other 50 states, has put in nearly $200 million over the last 4 or 5 years to provide you with the extra help you need to get the skills you need to succeed. And finally, if you are a part of a group that, to raise the example you raised, Alice, if you're a student who has the skills but just can't show them on a paper and pencil test, the state has an appeals process that allows you to show that if your grades are more or less the equivalent to your classmates' grades who passed, and you've shown up and you've taken advantage of their extra programs, then you get your diploma. So in its sort of creaking, inefficient, sometimes dismally late way, the state here has really tried to address a lot of the questions that you raise and a lot of the stinkiest parts of the inner part of this apple. There's a book here that I brought that I'm going to suggest that everybody in this room run out and buy and read. There's a chapter in it about the impact of peer culture here on immigrant kids. And the parting word I'm going to leave with you is that the impact of the whole higher standards movement here, based on the data that this guy produced, has been to help prevent immigrant kids who, by and large, seem to have better work ethic and are more ready to do what needs to be done to not just attend college, but succeed in college, from being dragged down by a peer culture in the United States, which we all can agree too often doesn't support those ideals. And so the standards movement is a way to help you make sure that you don't get sucked into the lower expectations that have historically been true of the schools and too many kids here. And so that's why it's your friend, really. Thank you. The youngin is your friend. Yeah.
Okay, Andy, thank you. Jamie, you're going to pinch it for Felix.
I'm going to try.
Welcome.
Thank you. I guess I wanted to say first off that, going back to that survey that John was talking about that says, 66% of the people they surveyed said they don't think the MCAS is fair. And about half those said it's because they don't think one test should determine their future, or that it's unfair to ESL students. I guess I would say that Council Royale agrees with those students and thinks that the MCAS test should not be a graduation requirement, and that at most it should be part of a broader testing program. But with that said, and I can talk about that more later, or the reasons why, I think that'll be articulated later. I want to say that he also agrees with a lot of what Andy has said, and in that I think the 1993 Education Reform Act was an important reform and made a lot of improvements, and it laid out a way to bring accountability to the school systems in Massachusetts. But what's happened since the passage of the Education Reform Act, which is 10 years ago, is that the system, the broader system that it purported to establish, has been replaced by a single test. Something that the makers of the Reform Act never intended, and something that even the manufacturers of the test, people who developed the MCAS test, have been quoted as saying, we never intended this to be the single test of student achievement or to be a requirement for students to graduate. And so that's where we've really gone wrong, from where the founders, the people who drafted the Education Reform Act and who helped it pass and who brought all this money to schools, which they have really done, they've sort of lost their way a little bit when in implementing it, and in what's happened with the MCAS test becoming the standard for students, and the test of whether a student can continue on in their education or can even get a job that requires a high school diploma or that requires you to have graduated from high school. So with that said, I wanted to talk about two different solutions that we've come up with at the City Council level and that others have come up with too that we've adopted. One comes in the form of a resolution that the City Council passed back in March of last year, and as we were starting to face this the first wave of students graduating last year, were the first ones that had to pass the MCAS to graduate from Boston Public Schools. And the City Council passed the resolution, and I'm just going to read the resolve section. It says, resolve that the Boston City Council asked the Boston School Committee to postpone the use of the MCAS test as a criterion for graduation until there is no significant disparity between the outcomes of students in Boston's poorer and wealthier communities, and no significant disparity in the outcome of students of color and white students on the MCAS test. And that resolution was passed 11-1, which is sort of overwhelming for the council. I don't know what people know about the City Council, but we're usually more divided than that. And that's everyone versus Jimmy Kelly is what you get when you have an 11-1 vote. So I think it's fairly widely recognized, at least by the elected officials in Boston, that the MCAS as a graduation requirement is not working for the students in Boston. And I think Boston has the most diversity of any school district, and I think that's part of the reason why elected officials in Boston at least have realized that MCAS as a graduation requirement isn't really the only solution. And the other solution that we've come up with, and I think this goes back to what Andy was saying, that I think even the most vocal opponents of the MCAS, and my boss is one of them, believes that accountability in public education is important and that we need to be holding our students accountable. But what he said is, and what he usually says when he speaks in forums like this, is that he thinks accountability should be part of a broad program of accountability. That you need to have accountability for students, but you also need to have measures of accountability for the school districts, for the schools, for teachers, for parents, and that what we really need to come up with in the end is a system that issues, what would almost be called school report cards, where you assess the curriculum, the services that are provided to students, the teacher recruitment and retention, the special programs that are offered, and other measures of educational quality at the school. When you test the kids, one thing he often says is our kids shouldn't be the canaries in the mine shaft of education reform. And it's kind of a clever line, but I think it's really what it comes down to is what we're doing is we're saying if students aren't passing the test, then that's an indication of a wider problem. Just like the canary in the mine shaft, the canary dies, you've got pollution in your mine. But if you had testing equipment that tested the air in the mine first, maybe your canary wouldn't have to die before you figured out there was something wrong in your mine. So that's where we're coming from. Is we really do believe in accountability. We really do believe in high standards, and we really do believe that students need to be held accountable for the work that they do, and for the achievements that they've made. But punishing students by not allowing them to graduate because of a failure of their schools or their teachers or their parents. Or, with one test you can't measure whether the student just has failed to learn. You can tell that they failed to learn what's on the MCAS test, but you really are narrowing your focus too much, I guess is the bottom line. All in there.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you, Jamie. And John, you're somebody who's been in the field working on this, so we'd like to hear from you.
Well, good morning, everybody. My name is John Lindemood, and I was asked to come here this morning and talk a little bit about how a very large youth development organization in Cambridge grapples with the state mandate and how we have proposed intervention, what we've done with that, the kind of results that we have gotten, and what kind of implications we see happening in the future as a result of our intervention. So I've got a lot to cover in hopefully about 12 minutes or so, and I've tried to prepare a little text that will help me bring through all those points. I'd like to start just by giving you a brief snapshot of what we try and do in the workforce program so that you have some context from which to understand the rest of what we're doing with in regards to the test. The workforce is a comprehensive educational and career training program for low-income youth who live in Cambridge public housing. It was founded 20 years ago with the understanding that low-income students often fail where their middle-class counterparts succeed because they are not exposed to nor prepared for the same type of opportunities. For many of these students, 90% of whom are minority, 70% of whom are non-native English speakers, failure becomes the norm. The end result is that many are consigned to lives of economic and educational disadvantage, and another generation is trapped. Our mission has been to change that. Since its inception in 1984, the workforce has worked to help level the playing field by giving our students the tools they need to attain educational success and economic mobility. Our aim is to put students in possession of themselves, to provide each participant with sustained opportunities to expand their horizons of experience and to grow their personal and vocational identities. In the course of their workforce experience, students learn to forge their own pathways to success, expanding possibilities for themselves and their communities. Now, this is a tall order, requiring comprehensive programming and long-term investment in each participant. And I want to give you just a real brief overview of what makes our program so comprehensive. We're located on 3 of the largest housing development sites in Cambridge, which gives us very good access with parents and their families. We provide broad networks of support and learning and homeschool and work from starting in the 8th grade and continuing all the way up through senior and high school. We offer a 5-year curriculum which highlights the relationship between academics, life skills development, and vocational skills development. We have an individualized support plan for the student that annually measures their life skill competencies, their work-related competencies, and how they're doing academically, so that we bring them up step by step through those 5 years. And we also have an employment component, which we've worked very hard to establish in recent years, which partners with about 40 to 50 public and private sector employers in Cambridge as a means of allowing each student the opportunity to gain an understanding of what different careers are like, basic job experience, and those are paid, 2/3 of which are paid by the workforce itself as a means of attracting employers to our program. Now, this holistic design has achieved some very good results. 75% of the students who start the program in the 8th grade finish as seniors and stay for the full 5 years, which is something we're very proud of. And in the last 10 years, 85% of our participants have gone on to 2- and 4-year colleges. So where does that lead us? Well, despite the success in assisting students to utilize education to break the invisible bonds of public housing, we found in our follow-up with graduates in recent years that many have been ill-equipped academically and were struggling to keep up with the demands of college. This trend was confirmed by the Cambridge School Department's student data report nearly 4 years ago, which reflected a pattern of increasing underachievement among minorities and low-income students. who account for well over 40% of the public student population in Cambridge. Close to half, let me just sidestep this a little bit, close to half of the students that go to Cambridge Regional Latin High School live in public housing, which most people are not aware of. So this is very, very important. The student data report reconfirmed what we had publicly been warning to limited effect for a number of years, that the system was failing our students and they were falling through the cracks. The advent of the MCAS test as a graduation requirement for these students only exacerbated the immediate problem. Our students' reactions to the test ran the gamut from indignation to resignation to complete apathy. Regardless of how we as educators felt about the high-stakes testing, we knew that we were at a critical juncture and that immediate action needed to be taken to address these disturbing trends. While many educators in our city responded by mounting a campaign of protest, we felt obligated to do what was necessary to empower our students to pass the test. We ended up doing more than what was necessary. Prompted by our concerns, the workforce responded by developing a comprehensive long-term approach to deal with both the test and the larger issues of underachievement. Politically, our planning process culminated in advocating for the city's schools to develop a strong internal focus on literacy. We ramped up our own efforts to enhance our participants' reading and writing skills through a broad-reaching literacy initiative, weaving into our existing curriculum and program structure a new thread of literacy-building activities. Over the past 2 years, we have launched a successful summer literacy camp for our workforce students who are preparing to enter into high school. We have reading and learning enrichment centers at each of our sites, and story book hours and book centers, book groups that involve local volunteers and lots of visiting librarians from the city libraries. While these efforts should, and we hope, improve workforce students' critical literacy skills over time, the immediacy of the MCAS as a graduation requirement was and continues to be of great concern to us. Among the high school sophomores who took the test in 2001, the first class for whom the passage of MCAS was a graduation requirement, workforce students failed at twice the rate of the whole class as a whole. We responded with extensive remediation measures and began to assist school personnel with preparations for materials that would help them with the appeals process. While both of these measures stood as important steps, we recognized early on the importance of reducing the failure rate by preparing our students in advance, not after they had failed the test for the first time. As a result, with financial backing from the schools, we have developed an MCAS prep program that now operates with close to 50 of our freshmen and sophomores at 2 of our workforce sites every Thursday night. Students receive math and English instruction from 4:30 to 7:30 with an integrated schedule between classes. And again, I want to underscore the importance that our prep work here is but one of a broader constellation of initiatives embedded in the program's 5-year structure that we felt would help our kids not only pass the test, but to help them have the kind of academic footing that they need to go on to have personal and professional success. So the idea here is continuity of support. And what we've tried to do is build a system where our participants complete the first year with the program as 8th graders. They're involved in an intensive summer literacy camp over the course of that first summer that addresses primarily reading comprehension skills and really works hard to develop their reading and writing skills. And from there, once they complete the camp program, they're placed automatically in our MCAS prep for 2 years. You guys all know that the 10th graders take it in the spring year. We start these kids in the 9th grade, go through 1 full year, have another summer literacy camp, and come back for their 2nd year. And hopefully they're ready to go by the time they hit the test at the end of their sophomore years. This year will provide us with the first accurate measure of how our system works, since our 10th graders will be the first group to complete the first full 2 years of literacy enrichment in our MCAS prep program. So what have we learned out of this experience? First, as more and more schools and organizations are learning, preparatory and remediation efforts of this kind cannot be done willy-nilly. They require a great deal of integrative planning and organization, and force us as educators to wrestle with a broad range of pedagogical dilemmas, behavioral management issues, assessment strategies, problems stemming from disparities in student skill levels, lack of background knowledge, and the like must be routinely considered. 2, support efforts must begin early and be sustained over a long period of time. The accent should be on preparing our students to succeed rather than trying to deal with the emotional fallout after they have failed. Procrastination and apathy are ever-present problems that must be addressed when you start preparing students nearly 2 years in advance of the 10th grade test. Third, while addressing skill deficiencies really forms the backbone of most MCAS prep efforts, addressing the emotional side of test taking is of equal, if not greater, importance to our students. As we know, many of our immigrant students feel estranged from both school and home, caught between competing cultural claims. Diminished in a culture of low expectations, many have been silently passed along through the system and have learned to internalize failure and equate their performance with their worth. Sadly, this effect is cumulative, and as a result, it's not hard to grasp why many of our students have their brakes on about the MCAS test. Helping students to peel back the layers of internalized failure and to surmount their fear goes hand in hand with imparting the knowledge necessary to pass the test. It's difficult to convey a sense of urgency to our students, a sense of long-term ramifications of not passing the test, without compounding a sense of shame many of them feel surrounding their ability to learn. Lastly, educated buy-in from parents is absolutely critical. Few of us ever talk about this issue in regards to doing this kind of work with our students. One of our mantras of the program is, if you want to work effectively with kids, you have to work effectively with their parents and take that on and all of the responsibility that's required to get the job done. It requires a great deal of diligence and effort. For those of us who work with immigrant parents, understand the barriers and issues these parents contend with on a regular basis. Due to cultural influences and or language barriers, many silently defer to educational authorities. Many feel powerless and disenfranchised from the educational process. And many remain confused about what the schools expect of their children. At Workforce, we address these issues through regular contact with parents, but we also convene large parent forums where school principals and administrators discuss school-related issues and language-sensitive groups conducted by outside facilitators. So where do we go from here? First, academic underachievement among students of color is a problem for which schools, properly equipped, must take primary responsibility. I think we're all in agreement about that. However, the task at hand is one that will not be resolved by schools alone. We need more substantive collaborations between local schools and proven after-school programs, which maximize the educational supports for the very students that the schools find hardest to serve. Based on our own recent experience, the alignment of our respective domains can make a critical difference in the lives of low-income students. As pertains to the state testing mandate, we have come to view MCAS as a short-term obstacle that has the potential to pave the way for long-term opportunities. Discussion of MCAS invites polarization, but regardless of where you land ideologically on this issue, the fact remains that the test has stimulated debate surrounding the achievement gap accountability and has forced us to reckon more deeply with our educational system's inequities. The presence of the MCAS has helped to bring to light the wholesale changes that need to be made in our educational ecosystem if we wish to fully prepare our students of color, our new young Americans, for personal and professional success. We all know that few things can be more difficult. No one thing, not high-stakes testing, smaller class sizes, or any of the educational fads or quick fixes that are annually paraded out can serve as a cure-all. Systemic changes are required, from attracting candidates of higher caliber to the teaching profession, to better equipping our teachers for increasingly heterogeneous classrooms, from finding better ways to blend innovation with accountability, to erasing funding and resource disparities between wealthy and poor communities. The list goes on and on. Only if we attend to these issues holistically can we create and sustain a humane culture of high expectations for all of our students, where each is afforded genuine opportunities to prepare for a meaningful and fulfilling life. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, John, and to all the panelists for provocatively getting us started on what I hope will be a good conversation about this important topic, and a topic that embodies a lot of our hopes and aspirations for young people in our society. I'm going to take a minute to just frame what I hope will be an interesting ensuing discussion about this subject in a couple of ways. Number one, standards-based reform, as it's been described and implemented here, I think it's important to remember, was an intervention designed, as Andy has indicated, to fix a system that was fundamentally inequitable in its outcomes. In other words, the system that preceded this system was one, as John has alluded to in his remarks, in which there were widespread inequities in the results and performance of students. Standards-based reform includes at least three components, but I think it's important in a discussion about MCAS, because we tend to get focused on MCAS because it's real and concrete, to make sure in our conversation that we take account of the components of standards-based reform, first of which is standards, the notion that you can identify a set of skills and knowledge that young people will need in order to be successful at the next stage of their lives, which is usually higher education or employment. So the notion that we as adults in a society can agree upon and identify a set of skills and knowledge that they will need to proceed to the next step. We embody those in standards, and we want to have the same standard for all young people in our society, not variable standards where we expect less of some people and more of others, but the same basic equitable standard for everyone, a guarantee that we owe them because we owe them the ingredients of success, or the opportunity to have success at the next stage in their lives. Second component is the focus of our discussion today, which is assessment. How do we measure, if we can agree on the standards, how do we measure whether or not they've actually attained them? Do they have the knowledge and skill that's necessary for them to proceed to the next level of their lives and careers? And then we look at the instruments, the way in which we measure. Is this a valid, in other words, does it measure what it says it is supposed to measure, tool? Is it a reliable tool? Will it do it reliably under a variety of circumstances and time after time if you administer it? So we have a conversation about the actual test itself. That's the assessment. A third thing, and really I would submit most of the emotion that gets generated around the topic of MCAS, has to do with what states, if any, you choose to associate with the assessments. And in this state, we've associated a graduation requirement with the assessment, and that has led to the controversy. Some will argue that's fundamentally inequitable, and we've heard that right from Alice from the beginning today, that the idea of attaching that much weight to a particular test is fundamentally unfair. Others will say you can't get the equity argument to resonate with people. You can't get them to take seriously the notion of high standards for all students unless you find a way to make it count. And so this, the attachment of stakes is often an effort to say, this counts, this is important, this matters, it makes a difference in people's lives. So we have those three elements. I'd like to begin our discussion, maybe a bit provocatively, but by saying the following. I think it's a political reality when we look at federal legislation and we look at state politics, if you will, that the notion of high standards for all young people, the notion that we will have assessments, and the idea that those assessments will have at least some consequences associated with them is going to be here for some time to come. It's not likely to change politically. Nor is it necessarily desirable if you agree with the premise of standards-based reform that there is an identifiable set of skills and knowledge that you would like all people to have before proceeding to the next level. It isn't necessarily then desirable to say we want to carve out a category or a group of students who we are going to pass along to the next level even though they don't have these skills and that knowledge. Because you could argue that then as a punishment to those students because we are disadvantaging them at the next stage. And John has cited some statistics about success rates of various students as they proceed through college. So I'll offer that as an assertion about the reality. What I'd like to focus on in terms of our discussion today is we have embodied, at least in the intent in this legislation, the notion that we should expect the same thing of all students, and we should get them to a higher standard than we've ever gotten to before, particularly in our urban communities, because we know that many of these standards have been attained in suburban school districts around the Commonwealth prior to the imposition of standards. But we're now saying we don't want a diploma coming from the Boston Public Schools to stand for a lot less in terms of skill and knowledge than a diploma coming from the Wellesley High Schools. So if that's our fundamental belief, that we want to get all of our students to a high standard, and holding aside for a moment the question about how we measure it and what consequences we associate with it, what are the interventions? What are the things that the state or the school districts or municipal governments need to do, in addition to what has already been done, to guarantee that those students, and particularly the students that we're talking about today, immigrant students, young Americans who have particular challenges as they come and integrate into this society, what are the things that we need to do in particular for them to get them to a high standard, whether or not we associate consequences with the assessment of that performance at that standard? So let me open that up first, see if any members of the panel have comments that they'd like to make on the desirable interventions. And John, you've certainly given us a few in terms of the kind of program you've described, but I wonder if any of the others. Alice, are there things that you, from your perspective, the students you talk about and care about, the students who feel this is unfair in some respect to be held accountable to this standard, are there things that they could use in terms of further help to attain a higher standard of learning than they're now able to attain in the school that you attend?
Well, first of all, for example, there's students in my school that the first year they get into America, they take MCAS. And in my country, for example, I'm from a third world country where education is just a dream for some of us. Actually, the majority of us, because there's no higher education over there that we can get. So once we get the idea that we're coming to the United States or a second or first world country, what we think about is, oh, I'm planning to get a higher education. So that's our goal, to come here and get a higher education. And once we come here, we get to this point that we have to, this test that we have to take. Some of students, for example, if we come, you're in 10th grade here, they put you in 10th grade here or 11th grade, you have to take the MCAS in your first year. With English, you're in ESL 1. How are you going to pass that test? And even though if you're not in ESL 1, just that there's, how should I say it? We don't get as much help as we could to help us pass the MCAS. For example, in my school they give MCAS prep, but it's just they give it to first it's seniors, and first it goes for seniors and then juniors, and then it comes to sophomores. But the MCAS prep is just 30 minutes or less than that, or sometimes teachers doesn't show up. So what we do, we sit there, and the teacher doesn't show up, we have to go home. What I think, in my opinion, is that we don't get as much help as we could.
Okay.
As the students in suburban.
Let me ask the question in a different way. Let's assume you didn't have to contend with MCAS, and you arrive from another country in the way that you describe, and you arrive at the high school level, and you want to get ready for higher education. You want to get ready for college because that's a hope that you have, and that's a part of your dream in coming here. What is it that you need that you're not currently getting in school to get the skill, to get the knowledge that you will need to be successful in college, totally apart from anything to do with MCAS? What else? How can your schools more effectively serve you and your peers to get you learning at higher levels so that you can be guaranteed to be successful in college? Well, let me let you think about it and see if there are other folks who want to comment on any of this discussion.
Thanks. Paul, I'm so glad you have focused the conversation here, because this is the most real stuff. It's how all billion some odd state policies have any impact at all in investments, in what's happening in your classroom, and you say, Alice, you've been here 4 years. Mm-hmm. Is that right? I made a brief allusion to the state's investment that was a considerable one up until this year, as many of you probably know, in the remediation programs of the kind that you have been part of, and that was the state's gamble to help make up for the fact that it was holding students accountable while the system caught up with them. It was saying, look, 10 years from now, public education is going to be so good if we do things right that nobody, or a very small percentage are going to need these extra help programs. But while we've got this first 2 classes of canaries going into the coal mine, if we're going to be able to look at ourselves in the mirror in the morning, we've got to give these kids some extra help. Up through last year, the legislature and the governor and everybody else was able to see their way to putting $50 million in a year into those programs. And one of the other reports that I brought here is a survey of kids in Boston and Worcester and Springfield, asking them about those programs. Some are not very good, some are in the middle, some are pretty good. By and large, the kids who've taken those have said, 80% of them said that they count them as one of the principal reasons why they felt more comfortable working in schools. It helped them understand that they needed to put in extra effort to get to the place where they wanted to be, and they would recommend them to other students. And the reason why is that when they described what was going on in those classes, it was sort of a picture of what education ought to look like. The teacher-student ratio was much lower. There were real clear incentives and outcomes, so the kids knew why they were there and knew what they wanted to get to at the end of their semester-long or 5-week summer program or whatever. In some cases, the teachers were handpicked to teach these courses. So a lot of the things that get in the way of education being the way it ought to be were taken care of when they created these courses. This year, unfortunately, a lot of those have gone away. So,
all right, let me, the interesting thing to me about that comment is the way in which you preface it is ultimately this shouldn't be about remedial programs. Ultimately, this should be about the entire $6 billion that we spend on education throughout the state being focused on giving kids what they need in order to be successful at the next stage in life. But these remediation programs are a temporary mechanism. Jamie, I think you wanted to get in.
I guess I was going to add that I think one of the things is what you're talking about brings up is what we're going to do about bilingual education and about teaching immigrants and others who are limited English proficient, teaching them English. At the same time, I think what you're suggesting is that we ought to have the same standards, and I want to focus on them. Let's focus on the math standards. If we want every student to have the same math standards, I think we have to take into account to some extent whether we ought to be teaching limited English proficient students math in Spanish, or in Portuguese, or in one of the many languages that are spoken by students at home, and while they're learning English. I think it's particularly in the case that Alice suggested, where a person is moving into the country from somewhere where they don't speak English. You're moving in 9th, 10th grade, and you're being asked to take a test almost immediately. It seems especially unfair to be suggesting that they ought to be catching up so quickly in a language that they're just learning themselves.
Fair enough, and there's a whole discussion happening this
Right.
afternoon at 1 o'clock on that.
Yes, but I think that's one area where that's the extra help that you can give people is teaching them the basic standards in a language that they can understand.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
If the minority is going to become majority in the city of Boston, why not the school system or all the policies making focus on this minority is going to become majority? Focus on the culture, focus how they learn things in the country, and also in the language. I think it's unfair when the students show up fresh here to tell them what to do. But there is the progression, nothing available for them. Even you have a bilingual program, you have the staff, there is money, and teachers are not available, and teachers don't spend enough time to explain to students what they need to do. So what I'm saying is that why don't we frame the curriculum according to each ethnic group? If the city is so rich, so much money.
Let me turn that back to you and ask you, what would that look like, given the fact that we have dozens and dozens of ethnic groups within the city? We have, to your point, we already have a substantial majority within the school system. Now you have lots and lots of different cultural and ethnic racial groups within the school system. How do you proceed? What would you do? If we were to realize the vision that you have, what would that look like as it played out in particular schools?
What I would do, and I was thinking about it, is start from the community-based organization. All the gatekeepers that work with parents and work with students also, we struggle all the time at least to have a meeting. We don't have money, it's difficult to find space. Even the state has money, but just to request the money takes a while. So why the money is not available in school district, or in school for parents and also for students? Why don't the schools not open 24 hours a day or like 16 hours a day? School buildings that close at 3:30, the kids are outside on the street. Why don't we frame something around the students, the parents, on the entire neighborhood?
Okay.
That's what I'm doing.
Fair enough. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Everything I'm hearing is feeding into what you were talking about with your onion metaphor. And I think that there's another layer beyond addressing, and that's the political layer. That's a big, big layer in the onion. And it seems to me important as a Commonwealth citizen as well as a citizen of American culture to recognize the role that politicians have to play in resolving the problem is essentially a cultural problem. That solving accountability in education is just such a small piece. It feels like a short-term, quick solution, which we're famous for demanding in this culture, that has so many more layers that have to be dealt with. When you're talking about canaries with mineshaft and students playing that role, so are teachers. Teachers are very unhappy people these days, feeling like they are expected to provide a solution to a broad cultural problem that needs addressing. As Americans, we're famous for wanting a quick answer to very difficult questions. It's too expensive in terms of time as well as money to try to address the reality of the solution, which is stop the top-down solution, stop looking at the end result and trying to solve that problem, but looking at the beginning and building. The money needs to go at the beginning. It needs to go to pre-K programming. It needs to go to family support programs. It needs to be a much broader-based one before the educational system can have the accountability that it deserves. We all are eager to see our students approach the college experience where my life is better prepared. But I don't think it's a realistic or an achievable goal to start in the 8th grade, frankly. The kids have too long given up on themselves, and their families don't have the resources to make it possible in 4 years or 2 years to get them to the test. It needs to happen so many times. And if we could start with community-based organizations to get parents more involved. The Head Start model, where every aspect of the family's life is contributing toward their child's success in school. It's not going to happen, I don't think, until we accept that as a reality.
Fair enough. And I hear that argument. I understand that argument that there's so many factors outside of schools or preceding schools that really the burden that we've now put on schools and students to achieve standards is unrealistic. And you suggested some investments that we might make and some directions we might move. But I guess the question I'd have back to you then, we're still making an enormous investment in schools, K-12 schools, and in some instances preschool opportunities as well now. As a society, we're making an enormous investment. You're saying it's unrealistic to hold them to the kind of high standards we have. What sorts of standards of performance ought we to have in order to justify the kind of investment we're making in education?
I don't want to argue against the necessity for standards. I agree that there have to be standards that the society we exist in requires in order to function. I guess I'm going to do what you do and turn the question back to you. What would Howard Gardner say? How can we get a recognition that not only are there language differences and cultural differences and other kinds of differences, but there are learning differences, and that a standardized test system doesn't acknowledge that. That it looks for people who are good standardized test takers, and that's all that we can demand of it, because that's what it's designed to do. But what about people who demonstrate a broad base of information in other ways? Aren't there alternative assessments that we should be looking at a great deal more closely? If we want to say all students deserve to reach the same standard, and that a culture deserves to have students who can do that, and that colleges deserve to receive students who are prepared for the college experience. But testing them in a single manner, in a structure that is designed for a certain limited set of skills, doesn't meet that need. How can we broaden the assessment system?
No, I mean, I think that's a fair challenge, that it ought to be broader and deeper than it is. And at the same time, there are certain basic literacy skills and math skills that we want everybody to have and be able to demonstrate. And we also, there are alternative ways and appeals processes for demonstrating that. And it's a blunt instrument. As you point out, it's a blunt instrument. However, it's probably superior to no instrument at all. In other words, if the assertion is that, really most of these kids have the skills and knowledge they need to be successful in college, it's just the MCAS doesn't measure them, then I guess I'd have to say I fundamentally disagree with that. I don't believe it. I don't believe, and I think the track record of our prior system that didn't have standards and assessment demonstrates all too well that kids coming out of urban school systems were not getting the skills and knowledge they needed to be successful. Yeah, wherever. There were huge inequities.
I'm thinking, what would happen to my children if I suddenly moved to Japan?
Yeah.
Would I be given, X number of years to bring myself up to a standard, or them up to a standard before they had to meet whatever assessment system exists in that culture? I don't think that the need for standards is the question, at least not for me. That every culture has a certain set of needs that they need its population to be able to meet. And ours is obviously changing so dramatically and so rapidly.
But what we're groping for, what MCAS represents is an attempt by policymakers to grope for and grab hold of some way of making that standard real. In other words, we can all at a rhetorical level, you say, yeah, we ought to have high standards for all students. We ought to be fair and expect the same thing of everyone. But in reality, for example, we had an assessment program that preceded MCAS. Most people probably don't remember it. It was called the Massachusetts Education Assessment Program. And it showed widespread, huge disparities in performance among students around the state. The difference was nobody cared or paid attention because it didn't make any difference. We just accepted it. We said, that's the way it is. What do you expect? Kids in Lawrence aren't going to be doing as well as kids in Andover. That's just the way of the world. And we go about doing our business in the way that we do our business. Now you come along and the legislature says, well, that's not good enough. We shouldn't tolerate Holyoke having the achievement levels that it has, why we allow people in Amherst to score at high levels, we ought to be doing something to say to the educational system in Holyoke, you got to perform at a higher level. We got to do better by these kids. And if it takes money, we'll put some money in, which the state did. And then it said we're going to make explicit at least what our expectations are, so that at least it's in the face of educators and policymakers in the Commonwealth right now that there are these disparities and we ought to be doing something about it. Now the question we have to examine today is, what do we do about it? We had a couple of comments in the back. Did you? Yeah, go ahead, please.
I want to answer the question that Alice didn't answer.
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm an immigrant, right? And I attend school in Chester. And for example, we Cape Verdeans, we feel that we suffer a lot of discrimination in our school. We don't receive the same treatment as the American kids receive. In my class, just because the majority of us are Cape Verdeans, this American girl, she didn't want to stay in that class because we were Cape Verdeans and she didn't want to stay with us. So when the teacher is trying to teach something, the American kids were like, they'll be making all the noise, they don't want to pay attention. So while we are trying to learn to succeed in this country, they're making like they're making stuff that we won't be capable of attending the class and to do what we have to do in order to pass the MCAS. Also, there was this teacher in my school that one student, he was interviewing this teacher, and he asked him about the immigrants, and the teacher was like, oh, I don't like the immigrant students. So is this teacher capable of teaching immigrant students while the majority of those students in my school are immigrants?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, that's the kind of testimony that I think is everybody in the room would be in agreement with, that that's unacceptable, and that we ought to have some kind of standard of performance that applies to teachers or to codes of conduct among students in school environments that doesn't permit for that kind of thing. So I appreciate you for bringing that up. Yes, ma'am.
I'd like to ask a question that is based on some economic issues. There was an article in the middle of the front page of the New York Times yesterday, a story that was not covered in the Globe, about a report that just came out of the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, sounding a highly alarmist note about what was happening to the U.S. economy with the growing deficits, pointing out that within a few years it is possible that we will owe 40% of our GNP. And that coupled with the fact that we of all the industrialized countries now have the steepest social and economic stratification, a difference that, for example, in Massachusetts, the average household income in Springfield is about $8,000 a year versus in Weston, I believe it's about $160,000 a year. Springfield, of course, as most of us know, has a very large Latino population. Couple that with one other thing. Today, in the New York Times, again, front page article, Bush proposing a new space program. Very ambitious program to put some kind of permanent installation on the moon and in addition get to Mars. He's also proposing at the same time to have the deficit after the election. I want to ask you all where the money is going to come from, given also the approaching retirement of the baby boomers, of which generation I am a member, and most of you are also. Where is the money going to come from to implement these higher standards in a humane way?
Okay.
At the same time, growing social disparities in this society.
All right. Fair question. Anybody want to comment on that?
Well, I'll give you an answer that I'm sure is already turning around in your mind, and it's not really the short-term answer, but the long-term answer, and that is that, you know, the only road to economic recovery and success for us cumulatively is education. We've now, past NAFTA and everything else, gotten to the place where we've begun to push out all the low-skill manufacturing and other kinds of jobs to other countries, and that pace is only going to accelerate. So if we have a prayer of having an economy that is vibrant enough to pay back into the system enough to produce the education that we need, then we have to make the bet right now, and whether it's money that would come from a space station that doesn't get built, or from defense systems that don't need to be built, or what. But if I ran the zoo, the long-term bets that I would be making would be in developing the highly skilled workforce that this country needs to develop an economy that will serve our needs. None of those other investments are going to do that.
Okay, we've got several more questions, and we're going to adjourn at 10 after, I think, because we started about 10 minutes late. So I think you had a comment.
Yeah, I came in late, but I guess I went in response to your answer about the question of standards. I'm not opposed to standards at all, but there has to be an equity of resources, which has to take into account the economic levels of the community. If I live in Weston and I can afford for my kid to go to some fancy private testing service to, get prepared for MCAS, that's a different situation than if I live in Dorchester and my kid goes to Dorchester High and I don't have, maybe I don't have those resources. So, the standards across the board is all very well and good when we talk about what the resources and the equity is across the board. That's part of the standards conversation that I don't believe happens enough.
Okay, I think some panelists had talked a little bit about that perhaps before you came in, but I think they're inevitably linked, and you can't ask for the attainment of high standards if the system doesn't have the capacity to produce it. So I think it's a fair comment. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I just want to follow up with that comment. Is that in terms of fairness and accountability and resources, I don't think there's sufficient resources currently for districts such as Lawrence to meet the curriculum framework that's called for. And the Hancock case is being discussed now is a suit that every single testimony so far has said that those communities do not have sufficient resources to meet the curriculum framework that's called for under education reform act. So why should we hold these children accountable and district accountable when we do not have sufficient resources currently? And second comment I wanted to make is that shouldn't it be a standard? I believe in higher standards. Shouldn't it be a broader standards covered by the curriculum framework instead of the narrow focus that's being implemented right now under the MCAS requirement and the high stakes nature of that? And also, shouldn't the goal of education to have children, all children, to reach their utmost potential, depending on their skills, because we have to recognize that the birth skills of the children in the Commonwealth, including artists, some could be in other skills. Why should we hold them accountable to the whole long range, the series of disciplines and standards that they have to meet eventually? Right now, just math and English, but actually they call for other MCAS tests down the line, including social studies, history, and so forth. And to illustrate that point, I just want to make to give you a short story, is that back in 1970, before ed reform, there was somebody who was a Cape Verdean immigrant, came to the United States as a teenager. I think he was maybe 13 years old. And he went through the school system in Boston. And he did very well in the SATs, in chemistry, in physics, in math, and so forth. And he did very well in verbal tests and the SAT. And the guidance counselor told him that he should be a mechanic because he showed some skills in terms of being a car mechanic, but he wanted to go to college. The only college that accepted him and could afford anyways was UMass Boston at that time. And he went into UMass Boston and he pursued his interest in English. He graduated, from UMass Boston English. Eventually, he went into Boston University, got his PhD in applied linguistics, went out as a professor of English at UMass Boston. So if MCAS was in place at that time, you would not have been able to pass the MCAS test in terms of verbal section anyways. And what do we do? I mentioned this point at other type of forums, and the answer I got was that, well, it will take time. Maybe you take 1 year, 2 years, a year, work 3 or 4 years, eventually you'll pass the test, then you can go on to college. But do you think that students should be forced to wait? And many of them actually do drop out and not pursue, in terms of the remedial program necessary for them to pass that test. Or should we offer them the range of access to and the basic skills, I believe we need basic literacy and math skills, and to be successful, in whatever career path that they pursue eventually. And instead of having the sledgehammer approach and putting a barrier for them to reach those goals.
Well, I guess the nub of that, and other people can comment on that, is what do you consider the basic skills, and what do you consider demonstration of competency in those basic skills? Now, you said you're comfortable with the notion of English and math skills at a basic level being required. And that's, in effect, what state policy is right now. And the question is, whether or not you think the levels that are being expected of people are reasonable or not, and whether or not you think the systems that have been set up as alternatives to that, appeals to that, if you can't prove competency through the standard MCAS, are fair and equitable systems for doing that. And I take it from your comment that you have reservations about that. But I think where we I guess get into difficulty is over what is it that we should be expecting of young people in general, and then when we look at performance, how high a performance is sufficient performance to warrant that individual being passed on to the next level, notwithstanding the fact that we can find exceptional individuals always through time who have survived in spite of not having the standard credentials. But as we're making public policy, we're attempting to achieve the greatest good for the greatest number of people in terms of developing public systems that serve them. So I see you shaking your head up in the back. Would you like to comment?
Yeah, I think that my disagreement is not what we should expect, but how we should achieve that goal. And I think that, like this gentleman was expressing, you're working. I think that the problem of education in the United States is not only immigrants related. It has been struggling comparing with other developing countries. And one of your quick solutions of responding to that, let's test people and see whether they have achieved or not. And perhaps the testing is important, but how do we prepare people? Because not only testing for being good students. And part of the issue that I'm seeing is that in terms of immigrants, the schools are one of the safe havens for students. We were looking at statistics this morning, and high rate of arrest among immigrants and dropping out from. So this is part of the thing that I wish you would look at. How do we keep students in school? Somebody was suggesting we could keep them open 24 hours, When you feel that you have then a population that really responds to schools and teaches that they are participating in that, then maybe you will start to look at standards. I'm not saying just give up standards, but there has to be hand in hand working with the needs of the students, how to prepare them as citizens. In the end result, is that what we want? Or is it just how do you pass an MCAS? It's sort of a simplification of the needs of the population.
Yeah. Well, I guess I'd argue that I think the imposition of the MCAS is again, as I tried to indicate when I began, it's not about the test. It's not about MCAS. The test is simply an instrument. It's a yardstick to measure performance against standards. And I think the political problem that education reformers back in the early 90s faced was you're not going to get society, you're not going to get policy makers or taxpayers to invest further in public education, which had such a checkered track record of success, unless you can show that there is going to be performance to a standard and you can somehow measure performance. And so a deal was made of higher standards and accountability in exchange for more resources. And so I think we're in an era now where we're talking about education being the primary investment that we make in young people, that for the foreseeable future there's going to be a demand for standards and accountability. The question is, how do we do it in a humane way? How do we do it in a way that honors all the things that we want to achieve through a public education? And they aren't just basic skills. Obviously, a well-educated, well-rounded person is educated for citizenship. They're educated to be lifelong learners. They're educated to be heads of families. And a whole bunch of aspirations that I think we all have. But at the same time, there's going to be this dimension of an expectation that schools do better in achieving their overall goal of excellence, and that they do better in terms of being fair to people. And prior to having this kind of standards or this sort of system, however flawed it may be, we tolerated widely disparate, widely unfair practice and outcomes in public education. And I think if we're going to succeed as a society, if we're going to thrive economically, we've got to be about remedying that. We may not have it right now, but this is an attempt to get it right. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, and I'm going to have to close out the discussion here. I want to thank the panelists, particularly Alice, who, in my view, gave an amazing presentation about her perspective and the way in which she was able to stand up and deliver. I know when I think of myself at that age, I couldn't have done anything like that. So I'm sure you're going to be very successful as you move on to college, and congratulations. Thank you for being with us today. Thank you to the other panelists for joining us, and all of you for some really thought-provoking responses to the panel's presentation today. Thank you.